They say history is written by the victors, but sometimes it is written by the ones who survive long enough to sign the death warrant. And in the winter of the year 1587, that signature belonged to a woman who had spent her entire reign dodging assassins, whispers, daggers in the dark, and most of all, the ghost of another queen, Elizabeth, the daughter of the woman who had died on a scaffold, and the man who had sent her there, rose to power, not through inheritance, but through survival. And she ruled England like a woman who never forgot how fragile crowns truly were. Across the border and across the sea, another queen had been born under brighter stars, Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots, crowned before her first birthday, draped in Catholic robes, kissed by royal legitimacy, and married into the most powerful court in Europe. But the stars faded, and what began as the promise of glory turned into 20 years of exile, imprisonment, betrayal, and in the end a botched execution that made even hardened men turn away. The story begins not on a scaffold, but in a cradle. When Mary was crowned Queen of Scots in the year 1542, an infant queen in a world of wolves, her life was one long procession of misjudged lovers and political disasters. First, the French prince who died too young. Then the drunken Lord Darnley, who wanted power more than he wanted a marriage. And finally Bothwell, the man many believed had orchestrated Darnley's murder, who abducted Mary and forced her into a union that turned Scotland against her. When she fled across the border into England in the year 1568, Mary believed her cousin Elizabeth would help her reclaim her throne. She did not understand that to Elizabeth, she was not a guest, she was a threat. For Mary carried something more dangerous than swords or armies. She carried blood, Tudor blood, Catholic blood. And in the eyes of many across Europe, that bloodline made her the rightful Queen of England. For nearly 2 decades, Elizabeth kept Mary close, but never too close. The Scottish Queen was housed in stately prisons, castles and manors with gardens and servants, her confinement more luxurious than many noblemen's homes. But make no mistake, she was a prisoner. And as the years passed, as rebellions sparked and papal bulls declared Elizabeth a heretic, Mary's presence grew heavier, more dangerous, more magnetic to Catholic plots. From the Ridolfi plot to the Throckmorton plot, one name always floated to the surface: Mary. And behind the curtains, Elizabeth's spymaster Francis Walsingham watched, listened, intercepted. He did not trust the velvet prayers or the embroidered handkerchiefs. He trusted ink, paper, and betrayal. And in the year 1586, he got what he had been waiting for. The Babington plot began like all foolish conspiracies do, with letters, with pride, with young men dreaming of glory. Anthony Babington, a well-bred Catholic loyalist, believed God had chosen him to free Mary, murder Elizabeth, and restore Catholic rule to England. But Walsingham was already inside the web. His agents intercepted the messages, broke the ciphers, and when Mary herself, careless or desperate, wrote back approving the murder of Elizabeth and requesting to be smuggled out once the deed was done, Walsingham had what he needed: treason. In the Queen's own hand. The letter was damning, not only in content, but in tone, in intent, in confidence. Mary had placed herself in God's hands, and in doing so, placed her neck on the block. The Privy Council raged. Parliament demanded action. Walsingham pushed, but Elizabeth hesitated. She had always hesitated when it came to Mary. This cousin, this mirror, this reminder of the life she might have had a queen born legitimate. loved by Catholics, called beautiful in every court. She walked through this woman, haunted her. To sign Mary's death warrant was to kill a crowned queen, an anointed sovereign, a woman chosen by God. And worse, it was to kill family. Elizabeth, who had sent countless men to their deaths without blinking, now blinked. She delayed. She prayed. She wrote and rewrote the order. And then, in the cold breath of February, she signed it. On the morning of the 8th of February, 1587, Mary Stuart walked into the great hall of Fotheringhay Castle. She wore red, the color of Catholic martyrdom. Her steps were steady, her face pale, but calm. The scaffold had been built in secret, covered in black cloth, surrounded by noble witnesses. The executioner knelt before her, asking forgiveness. "I forgive you with all my heart," she said. "For now I hope you shall make an end of all my troubles." Her ladies wept as they removed her outer garments, revealing the crimson sleeves beneath. She knelt. She whispered a final prayer, in manus tuas, Domine, commandui spiritum meum. And then the axe fell. But it did not end there. The first blow missed her neck and struck the back of her head. The second nearly severed it. The third, like a saw, finished the work. Her head fell, wig and all, and rolled across the scaffold, the face pale and hollow, the blood painting the floor like judgment. From beneath her skirts, a small dog emerged, trembling. The witnesses fell silent. It was not the execution of a traitor. It was the murder of a queen. Later, Elizabeth would deny she meant for the order to be carried out so quickly. She would rage at her council, weep in private, and confess on her deathbed that this single act had haunted her for the rest of her life. Mary's body was left unburied for months, then entombed in Protestant rites, then exhumed and reburied by her son James in Westminster Abbey. 2 queens, 1 crown, 1 death, and all because of a letter that should never have been written. It was not yet the end of spring when Mary Stuart looked down from the cold stone windows of Loch Leven Castle and knew she would have to run. The air was still, heavy with lake, mist and betrayal. And in her chest, something deeper than fear began to rise, a kind of royal instinct that told her the throne was already too far behind her to reclaim, and yet still too close to outrun. They had taken everything from her, her crown, her son, her voice, but not yet her name, and not yet her will to survive. It was the 2nd day of May, in the year 1568, when she found the key that turned inside the lock, the loyal hands that smuggled her past the guards, and the horse that galloped into legend beneath her trembling limbs. The Queen of Scots, disgraced, deposed, abandoned by armies and husbands alike, ran not toward home, but toward what she believed would be mercy. And when she crossed the border into England, still wet with sweat and hope, she thought she was stepping into sanctuary, but she had misjudged the nature of queens. Elizabeth Tudor did not come to the border. She did not send roses or banners or a welcoming court. She sent silence. And behind that silence came the cold men with sharp manners, and the letters signed with titles instead of names. Mary was taken into custody not with chains, but with velvet. Not with guards, but with gentlemen in high collars and gloves, who bowed low and said nothing of freedom. They called it protective custody. They housed her first in Carlisle Castle, where the rain tapped against the glass and the stone corridors whispered of kings long buried. And Mary, still believing in sisterhood and shared blood, wrote to Elizabeth letters filled with pleading, with reason, with royal dignity. She had been wronged, she said. She had been overthrown by rebels. She had fled to her cousin for help. Not punishment. She asked for a meeting. Face to face. Queen to queen. But no meeting came. Instead, Mary was moved. Like a prized chess piece, whose position must remain fluid, never too close. Never entirely removed. From one grand house to another. From Bolton Castle to Sheffield Manor. She was given all the trappings of nobility servants. Fine gowns. Tutors. Cooks. Even a physician. But none of the freedom. The door was always watched. The letters were always read. And though the rooms were warm, they were never hers. She kept up appearances. She wrote poetry. She embroidered. She played music. And she waited. She waited for Elizabeth to relent. For her son James to grow bold. For Spain or France to rise. But the waiting became its own prison. And the velvet began to suffocate. And yet Mary, even in confinement, was never still. She plotted with the only weapons left to her, words and faith. Catholicism became her cause as much as her comfort. Across Europe, whispers grew. In Rome, in Madrid, in the halls of power, and the back rooms of cathedrals. The name Mary, Queen of Scots, was spoken like a prayer and a warning. In England, Catholics dreamed of the day she would ascend to the English throne, restore the true faith, and burn away the Protestant order. Mary knew it. So did Elizabeth. And so began the quiet war spies and scribes. Coded letters smuggled in wine bottles. Names written in invisible ink. Messages wrapped in silk and hidden in the hems of dresses. Every whisper was weighed. Every visitor was shadowed. And Francis Walsingham, Elizabeth's eyes and ears, listened to it all. The plots came and fell like poisoned apples. The Ridolfi plot in 1571. A scheme that would have seen Mary marry Thomas Howard, the Duke of Norfolk, and ascend the English throne with Spanish help. It ended in execution. Then the Throckmorton plot in 1583. A plan soaked in foreign gold and ecclesiastical rage, hoping to spark an invasion, free Mary, and kill Elizabeth in the same breath. It too was uncovered. Each time, Mary denied knowledge. Each time, she survived. But her circle narrowed. The velvet turned darker. The rooms colder. The letters more dangerous. And still, Elizabeth hesitated. She did not want Mary dead. Not truly. For all her calculation and strength, Elizabeth feared the consequences of shedding royal blood. She had been born under a curse, her mother executed, her own legitimacy questioned, her throne forever uncertain. Killing Mary meant crossing a line that might never be uncrossed. And she knew that there were those who already saw her as a usurper, a bastard, a heretic queen in a stolen crown. If Mary died by her hand, would Europe ever forgive her? Would God Mary, however, saw the matter differently. With every passing year, her hope wore thinner, and her dignity grew heavier. She was a queen, not a prisoner. She refused to submit, refused to bow, refused to believe that Elizabeth's will was stronger than her own. She wrote to kings, to bishops, to the Pope himself, and somewhere in the aching solitude of her captivity, she began to believe what others had been whispering for years, that the only way back to a throne was through the end of Elizabeth's reign. And if that end required death, then so be it. But it was not Mary who would wield the knife. It was Anthony Babington who would write the letters, who would raise the hopes, who would promise the crown in exchange for murder. It was Walsingham who would intercept, decode, and deliver the fatal line. And it was Mary who, in a moment of recklessness or courage or despair, wrote back. Her words would be her undoing. But before the axe ever touched her neck, there were long nights in dim rooms, echoing prayers whispered in French and Latin, tears wiped away by hands wearing gold rings, and a dog who never left her side. There was memory and regret and defiance wrapped into every stitch of her embroidery. And there was one simple truth she never let go of. She had been born a queen, and she would die one. So when she finally left Sheffield for the last time and was taken to Fotheringhay Castle in the September of 1586, she did not scream. She walked as she always had, with her head held high and her words sharpened like glass. The trial was waiting. The sentence was already written. But for Mary, every moment still belonged to her. Even in defeat, she refused to bow. Even in exile, she was still a queen. And even as the walls closed in, she believed, somehow, that her name would outlive Elizabeth's silence. The ink had barely dried on the parchment before it was read, not by the man to whom it was addressed, nor by the queen whose life it hoped to unmake, but by the men who lived in shadows, whose fingers moved more silently than knives, and whose loyalty was not to a crown, but to a cause, and that cause was Elizabeth. In the year 1586, the war between queens had become a war of letters, and no letter was ever truly private, especially not when written by a woman whose name stirred rebellion in every Catholic heart from Edinburgh to Rome, especially not when her name was Mary, Queen of Scots. Inside Fotheringhay Castle, the stones were old and worn, and the wind slipped through the cracks like a servant without shoes. Mary had arrived there in September, knowing the place might be her final residence. But she did not beg. She did not tremble. She wrote. Each stroke of the quill was deliberate, elegant, wrapped in royal grammar and French formality. But behind the noble prose was something sharper intent. She still believed in plots, in rescue, in divine right. And so, when the letters came, letters hidden in beer barrels, in the stoppers of flasks, passed by, hands paid in silver and silence, Mary replied, and one letter in particular would become her noose. Anthony Babington was young, idealistic, full of fire and foolishness. He had read too many treatises on martyrdom and imagined himself a hero in the story of England's redemption. His plan was grand, reckless, swollen with the weight of impossible victories to assassinate Elizabeth, free Mary, raise a Catholic rebellion, and crown the rightful queen in glory. But Babington did not know that every step he took was already being watched, for Francis Walsingham had built a net that hung over the whole of England, and not a word passed without his notice. He had moles in court, spies in taverns, informants in monasteries, and men who could crack codes before the sun rose. And in the damp heat of late summer, Walsingham watched the trap close. The letters were written in cipher symbols and substitutions, the kind of secrecy that gives men a false sense of security. Babington wrote of 6 gentlemen who would remove the heretic queen. Mary's reply, written in the same hand that once signed royal pardons and marriage treaties, gave a blessing. She believed she was writing to allies. She believed her message would pass unseen. She believed the words would set her free. But she was wrong. The codebreakers in Walsingham's service worked by candlelight and silence. One in particular, a man named Thomas Philippes, held the key. He opened the letters like locks, unraveling them character by character, until their secrets lay bare. And when he deciphered Mary's consent to the murder of Elizabeth, he did not gloat. He simply handed it over. The Queen's spymaster, cold as stone and twice as patient, finally had what he had waited for: treason. Written not by rumor or by rumor's friend, but by Mary's own hand. The implications were enormous. Walsingham knew he had to tread carefully. Elizabeth was not a monarch to be rushed. She might rage in council, weep in private, lash out at servants. But she did not act without hesitation. She had spent years avoiding the final decision, dodging Parliament's demands, clinging to the illusion that Mary could be managed, that she might simply fade away in exile. But this letter changed everything. For the first time, the crime could not be denied. It was treason, and it was documented, and yet still. Elizabeth hesitated. She read the words, perhaps more than once, perhaps aloud, the affair being thus prepared. It shall then be time to set the 6 gentlemen to work. The phrasing was delicate, courtly, but it dripped with intent. Elizabeth saw through it. She felt the knife beneath the silk, but she also saw her cousin's face in her mind, beautiful once, regal, always. A woman who had known triumph and ruin in equal measure. Elizabeth remembered her own mother's execution. The way Anne Boleyn had knelt in French elegance. Her daughter declared illegitimate. Could she? Elizabeth. Now, send another queen to the block. But Walsingham did not live in poetry. He lived in consequences. And the consequence of inaction was death, not just Elizabeth's, but England's. Catholic powers were watching. The Spanish Armada was already in construction. The Pope had declared Elizabeth a bastard. If Mary lived, she would be used again and again. Her name sharper than any sword. So Walsingham pressed. He gathered the evidence. He arrested Babington and the other conspirators. He tortured them when needed. He drew confessions from them, like blood from old wounds. Babington named names, described meetings, wept, and begged. But it was too late. On the 21st of September, the execution of the conspirators was carried out with a cruelty that echoed through the cobblestones. They were hanged, drawn, and quartered, dragged through the streets, cut open while alive. Their entrails burned before their eyes. Their heads placed on spikes. It was not justice. It was a warning. And it was a prelude to what would come. Mary's turn was next. She had been moved to Fotheringhay not by accident, but by design. It was a place remote, contained, easy to guard, and easy to bury secrets within. Her trial was convened not in a public court, but before a special commission of 36 noblemen, many of whom owed their fortunes to Elizabeth's goodwill. Mary refused to recognize their authority. "I am no subject," she said. "I would rather die 1,000 deaths than acknowledge myself to be one." And she was right, in the strictest legal sense. Mary had never been an English subject, and thus could not commit treason. But laws, like queens, are often bent to suit the moment. The trial was a performance more than a deliberation. Mary defended herself without legal counsel. She claimed the letters were forgeries, the cipher corrupted, the testimony of Babington coerced, but she knew it would not matter. The verdict was already sealed in the eyes of her accusers. Walsingham's men had built the case like a scaffold, and now all that was left was for Elizabeth to climb the final step. But the Queen still stalled. The memory of her cousin's smile haunted her. The weight of divine right hung heavy. And Elizabeth, for all her political mastery, remained a woman raised on prophecy and fear. She did not want the blood of another anointed monarch on her hands. And so, she delayed. She wrote letters and crossed out the lines. She summoned Parliament and then dismissed them. She asked God for signs. And God gave her silence. But silence was no longer an option. Mary was not fading. She was burning her name, lighting fires in every Catholic corner of Europe. To let her live was to gamble with England's very future. And so, with the cold hand of duty upon her shoulder, Elizabeth reached for the quill. And this time, she signed. It was already over before it began. The scrolls had been drawn. The witnesses arranged. The verdict whispered behind closed doors long before Mary Stuart stepped into the great stone chamber of Fotheringhay Castle. The trial was a performance, a ritual dressed in velvet robes and sharpened pens. Its outcome as predetermined as the sunrise. 36 noblemen sat in judgment. But none came to listen. They came to confirm. And even they, bound in loyalty to the Queen of England, seemed uneasy in their seats, as if they knew the blade they were being asked to wield was not meant for a traitor, but for a queen, and that the blood it would spill might never wash clean. Mary entered the hall not as a prisoner, but as a sovereign. Her steps were slow but sure, her gaze proud, and in her hands, not tremble betrayed her. She was dressed in black, a symbol of mourning perhaps, or of warning. The room was heavy with silence, not the respectful kind, but the kind that clung to the walls, that pressed against the lungs of the men who had come to hear a trial, but were about to watch a sacrifice. Francis Walsingham, the spider at the center of Elizabeth's web, sat quietly, saying little, for he had already said enough in his reports, in the decoded letters, in the confessions tortured out of frightened young men. William Cecil, Elizabeth's oldest and most trusted counselor, leaned forward, pen ready, his eyes flicking between witnesses and paper, as if trying to keep the weight of justice from sliding off the scales completely. They had done this before. Not with queens, perhaps, but with rebels and schemers. Yet no rebel had ever carried the bloodline of Henry VII in her veins. No conspirator had once ruled a kingdom. Mary was denied legal counsel. She was denied the right to see all the evidence against her. She was denied the dignity of standing before her accuser. And yet she stood, firm and eloquent, her voice neither pleading nor resigned. She denied the charges. She claimed the Babington letters were forgeries, the cipher distorted, her seal imitated. She said she had no reason to plot Elizabeth's death, that she had come to England not to usurp, but to seek aid. She reminded them that she was a foreign sovereign, not an English subject, and that by their own laws, she could not be guilty of treason. But logic had long since left the room, and in its place sat fear, dread, and the grinding machinery of politics. The proceedings lasted days. Though time seemed suspended, Mary spoke with calm defiance. Her words more measured than many expected, more royal than some wanted. She spoke of her years in captivity, 19 long years in borrowed chambers and guarded gardens, 19 years of letters read by other eyes, of steps shadowed, of prayers interrupted by keys turning in locks. She spoke of betrayal not just from men who courted her power and abandoned her to ruin, but from the crown she had once trusted to protect her. She spoke, and the room listened. But the ink of judgment had already dried. Outside the hall, Elizabeth waited. She received the messages in her private chamber, her fingers running along the edge of the parchment, like one might trace the shape of a wound. The commissioners had done their work. They pronounced Mary guilty. The people, at least, the ones that mattered, were ready. Parliament had pressed again and again. "Kill her," they said, "or risk your own head instead." The Privy Council drew up the warrant. The pen was placed before the Queen. But Elizabeth did not sign. Not yet. In truth, she had known this day would come. From the moment Mary stepped onto English soil, dressed in the cloak of exile, but carrying the aura of destiny. Elizabeth had understood what was at stake. Two queens could not live beneath the same crown. One must fall. And now, the blade waited. Still, she paused. There were things no one could write into history. Things that curled behind the eyes of a queen alone in her chambers. Elizabeth remembered her father's wives. How many had lost their heads? How many children had buried their mothers? She remembered her own mother, Anne Boleyn, who had smiled bravely as the sword struck true. She remembered the silence that followed her mother's death. The way her own name had been erased, declared illegitimate, tossed aside until fate raised it up again. And now she, the daughter of the executed, was being asked to execute. She wept in secret, raged in private, snapped at those who came too near with quills and expectations. She asked for signs. She spoke to God. She argued with herself. And then, on the first day of February, in the year 1587, she signed. Her hand did not shake. The letters were clear, precise, the signature heavy with finality. The warrant was sealed, but even then, she hoped it might never be used. She gave it to her secretary, William Davison, with vague instructions. Some say she told him not to send it yet. Others say she simply looked away. But the council had waited long enough. They took the paper. They sent it. They arranged the execution with swift efficiency, as if afraid the Queen might change her mind if they delayed a moment longer. Fotheringhay Castle prepared the scaffold. The headsman was summoned. The carpenters hammered through the night. Mary was informed on the evening of the 7th of February. She had only hours left. She received the news not with despair, but with solemn resolve. She asked for writing materials. She composed her will. She wrote a final letter to the King of France, her cousin by blood and memory. She distributed her few remaining possessions: rings, rosaries, small tokens of affection to the women who had served her through exile and betrayal. She prayed. She did not sleep. That night, the castle did not breathe. The guards outside her door stood motionless, afraid even to blink too loudly. Inside, candles burned low, and the scent of wax mixed with the colder scent of fear. Her ladies helped her prepare, laying out the crimson velvet gown she had chosen for the occasion, the color of martyrdom in the Catholic Church. They brushed her hair. They whispered psalms. They kissed her hands and did not cry, not until she asked them to leave her alone. Somewhere in the castle, Elizabeth's name was spoken, not in anger, not in hatred, but with a kind of distant sorrow, like one might speak the name of a sister who had been lost to time. Mary did not curse. She did not beg. She did not protest the sentence that had been decided long before the ink met parchment. She had lived as a queen. She would die like one. And so, by the time the sun began to rise on that frozen morning, and the guards came to lead her to the great hall, the trial no longer mattered. The witnesses, the counsel, the arguments, and the ciphered letters, they were ghosts now. Shadows clinging to parchment that would yellow in the royal archives. The truth was simpler. Elizabeth had finally acted, and Mary, at last, They would answer for a crime she had always insisted was never hers. But history is not kind to verdicts written in fear, and some trials are never truly heard. No matter how loud the judgment echoes, the morning air was cold but still, the kind of stillness that settles when the world knows what is about to happen and refuses to interfere. At Fotheringhay Castle, the sun had not yet fully risen, but the hall was already filled with shadows that had nothing to do with light. Outside, frost clung to the stone like breath, frozen mid-sigh. Inside, footsteps echoed softly. Servants moved without speaking, and guards stood with their hands gripping spears they hoped would not be needed. It was the 8th day of February, in the year 1587, and by royal order, Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots, was to die before the morning was done. They came for her just after 7. The knock at the chamber door was not loud, but it was final. Mary had not slept. Her final hours had been spent in prayer, her voice low and measured, in Latin and French, asking for peace, asking for strength, and asking perhaps without truly expecting for forgiveness. She had dressed deliberately, each layer chosen not for comfort but for meaning. Beneath her outer gown she wore crimson, the deep blood red of Catholic martyrdom, a color that would speak when her voice no longer could. Her hair, once bright auburn in youth, was now concealed beneath a veil. Her jewels had been passed on to her ladies. Her soul, she believed, had already passed into the hands of God. The guards did not drag her. They did not touch her. She walked between them with a grace that unsettled the soldiers who expected something more broken, more afraid. Behind her came the small company allowed to accompany her in death, her steward, her physician, her apothecary, her surgeon, and her 2 faithful ladies, Jane Kennedy and Elizabeth Curl. These were the people who had witnessed her slow erosion over 19 long years of captivity, who had served her when her title meant nothing outside the velvet-lined prison of England, who had held her hand in illness and whispered to her in the long winters when hope was a memory. Now they followed in silence, their faces pale but determined. Each step weighted with the knowledge that their service would end with the fall of the axe. The great hall had been transformed. At the center stood the scaffold, built low, with 3 steps leading to the platform. It had been covered in black cloth, the color of mourning, the color of endings. On it stood a block, worn smooth by the hands of the carpenter who had crafted it in secret just days before. Nearby sat 2 chairs, one for the Earl of Shrewsbury, the other for the Earl of Kent, both assigned by the Queen to bear witness to the execution and ensure its legitimacy. They did not speak. Around them were guards, nobles, clerks, and a crowd of silent observers who had come not to cheer, but to watch. As one queen gave way to another, Mary climbed the steps slowly. Her hands did not tremble. Her voice, when she spoke, was soft and clear. She forgave the executioner. She told him she bore him no ill will. He was, after all, merely the hand of the state, not its heart. His name was Bull. He knelt before her and asked her pardon. She gave it, as graciously as she had once given favors at court in Edinburgh, as if this were merely a sad ceremony, not the final act of a long and brutal play. Her ladies helped her disrobe. They wept as they worked, unfastening the black gown to reveal the crimson petticoat beneath. The color startled those watching. It was not just royal. It was defiant. It said everything Mary could not. She was not a traitor. She was a martyr. Her faith would die with her, but her dignity would live. She handed her crucifix to Jane, her rosary to Elizabeth. She joked, softly, that never before had she undressed in front of so many men, and though the smile that accompanied the words was faint, it did not falter. A white veil, embroidered with gold, was tied around her eyes. It was delicate, almost bridal. She knelt before the block, placed her hands together in prayer, and whispered her final words in minuscuous. Domine, commendo spiritum meum, into thy hands. O Lord, I commend my spirit. The same words spoken by Christ on the cross, and by countless martyrs who had come before her. She was not flinching. She was not afraid. She was ready. The first blow missed. The axe struck the back of her head, burying itself deep into bone and flesh. A gasp moved through the room like wind through dry leaves. The executioner steadied himself, pulled the blade free, and struck again. This time, it hit its mark. The neck nearly severed, but a final tendon held the head to the body. And so, with grim determination, he lifted the axe once more and sawed through the remaining flesh. The head fell. He held it up for the crowd. God save the Queen, he said. But then the wig came away in his hands. The real hair, gray and cropped short, clung to the skull. The head tumbled to the floor, and those who had not yet turned away did so then. There was no cheer, no triumph, just blood, spreading slowly across the black cloth. A dog, Mary's small Skye Terrier, emerged from beneath her skirts, trembling and whimpering, unwilling to leave her side even in death. One of her ladies fainted. Another screamed, but most remained silent, for there was nothing left to say. The body was stripped, examined, and sealed in a lead coffin. No Catholic rites were permitted. No priest had been summoned. The Queen of Scots was buried like a heretic. Though she had died as a believer, her heart was sent away. Her dog was taken in by her servants. Her belongings were inventoried by the crown. In London, Elizabeth did not celebrate. When news of the execution arrived, she raged. She accused her council of betrayal. She claimed she had never meant the warrant to be carried out so soon. She dismissed William Davison, the secretary who had delivered the order, and imprisoned him in the Tower. But no punishment could change what had been done. Elizabeth would never fully forgive herself. She who had outlived so many threats, who had navigated conspiracies and wars and religious revolutions, and had now removed the one woman whose death she had feared most, not for its danger, but for its weight, for its permanence. Mary Stuart, the Queen in the North, the Catholic hope, the woman whose name had once rivaled her own in every court in Europe, was gone, and the silence that followed her execution was not peace. It was a silence filled with regret. The mourning ended. The scaffold was taken down. The hall was cleaned. The witnesses returned to their ledgers and letters, but the air in Fotheringhay never truly cleared. Something lingered there. Not just the echo of steel against bone, but the ghost of dignity, murdered by duty, long after the axe had fallen and the blood had dried. The real weight of the execution began to settle, not in the halls of Fotheringhay, where the wood had already been scrubbed and the scaffold taken down, but in the chamber of another queen, far away, where a single parchment signed in haste had become a wound that no crown could conceal. Elizabeth Tudor, Queen of England, defender of the realm, Gloriana to some, and bastard to others, did not speak of Mary's death for days, not in court, not in chapel, not even to the council who had urged her to do it. She sat alone in her chamber, the candlelight flickering over the still wet seal of a letter she had just written too late. Far too late. A letter of retraction. A command to halt the execution. A royal plea written by a queen who had hesitated too long, and then changed her mind too slowly. It had been sent only hours after the original warrant. Entrusted to a swift rider. Ordered with urgency, but Fotheringhay had already acted. By the time Elizabeth's second letter arrived, Mary Stuart's head was no longer on her shoulders. The men at the castle, bound not to the Queen's doubt, but to her signature, had carried out their duty with military obedience and political relief. There was no turning back, and now there was no one left to blame but the Queen herself. Elizabeth's fury was immediate. She called her council before her and raged with the fury of a woman who had lost control not just of a nation, but of herself. She accused William Davison, her loyal secretary, of acting without full authority, of misunderstanding her intent. She claimed the execution had not been meant to happen, at least not so soon. Davison, stunned and confused, insisted he had only done what he had been instructed to do. The council, tight-lipped and satisfied, watched in silence as the Queen turned on one of her own. Davison was imprisoned in the Tower. A scapegoat. A warning. But even that gesture could not change the truth. The sentence had been signed. The sentence had been carried out. And the sentence could never be recalled. What followed was not celebration. It was shadow. Elizabeth withdrew from public view. She wore black for weeks. Her usual sharp tongue fell silent in council. She did not visit her gardens. She refused music. Those who saw her during those days noted the hollow beneath her eyes, the way she stared not at her courtiers but through them, as if searching for something she had misplaced and could not name. She had been raised in a court of blood, had seen the fall of wives, the rise of traitors, the deaths of uncles and cousins. But never before had she caused the death of a crowned queen. Mary's blood was no ordinary blood. It was royal, sacred, anointed. The divine right of kings had been preached in cathedrals across Europe for generations. And Elizabeth knew the church would see this act not as justice, but as sacrilege. Mary had been a Catholic martyr in the eyes of Rome before she even died. Now she was a saint in death. Already. Whispers grew. Priests in hiding spoke her name during Mass. Letters crossed the channel, filled with anger and threats. Spain, already building its armada, took the news not as a blow to a rival, but as fuel for righteous vengeance. The Queen of England had killed the Catholic Queen of Scots. There would be war. There would be judgment. But even more than the political fallout, it was the private aftermath that tore deepest. Elizabeth had spent her life proving she was not her father, nor her mother. She had ruled without a husband, held power through intellect, charisma, and careful calculation. She had danced between factions, balanced religion with realism, survived rebellion, plague, and foreign threats. But in killing Mary, she had done something irreversible. She had become a woman who destroyed her own blood, who answered threat with death, and who found that even victory could feel like defeat. She tried to silence the noise. She banned discussion of Mary's death in court. She ordered that no public mourning be permitted. But the silence only deepened the guilt. At night, she did not sleep easily. Those close to her said she called out in her dreams, that she saw the scaffold, that she saw Anne Boleyn's eyes in Mary's final look. She refused to hear the word execution in her presence. When foreign ambassadors mentioned it, she turned her face away. When poets hinted at it, their verses were censored. But history does not forget, and neither did she. Months passed. Mary's body, after much delay, was buried in Peterborough Cathedral without Catholic rites, without choir, without crown. A Protestant service was read over her, though she had never abandoned the Mass, and her soul, if such things could weep, must have mourned even that. Her ladies were sent away, her belongings catalogued, but the memory of her lingered not in what she said, but in how she died. Years later, James, her son, would ascend the English throne as James I, uniting the crowns of Scotland and England in the very way Mary had dreamed, though never lived to see. He would order her body moved, reinterred in Westminster Abbey, across from Elizabeth herself. Two queens, two cousins, two histories placed side by side in stone, as if time had finally forgiven what the present could not. But for Elizabeth, while she lived, there was no forgetting. The execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, became the great shadow of her reign. It did not weaken her power. It did not undo her rule. But it haunted her. It followed her in portraits, in prayers, in the quiet moments between judgments. She had ended the threat. Yes, but at what cost? The woman who had defied Pope and King, who had refused to marry, who had crushed rebellion and conquered hearts, had done the one thing she had sworn never to do. She had ordered the death of another queen, and in doing so, had touched something that no monarch ever should: the sacred boundary between justice and vengeance, between duty and damnation. When Elizabeth died, many years later, in a bed surrounded by silence and the weight of time, her final days were marked by retreat. She refused food. She refused comfort. She refused speech. Some say she wept. Others say she simply stared into space, lips moving but voiceless, as if conversing with memories no one else could see. And among those memories, surely, was Mary kneeling at the block, robed in red, blindfolded in gold, whispering her final psalm into a room full of men who dared not answer. The sentence had been signed. The sentence had been carried out, and even as the years turned and the crown passed from one head to another, the echo of that sentence would never fully fade. There are tombs that are built to glorify, and there are tombs that are built to contain. Some are carved in marble, with angels weeping over them, and others are buried beneath years of dust and forgetting. But in Westminster Abbey, in the soft silence of the royal chapels where the air smells faintly of old stone and incense long since faded, there lies a tomb that holds not just a body, but a wound, and across from it, facing her even in death, lies the woman who made the decision to end her. Two queens, two cousins, two stories that could never be told at the same time. And when the world was no longer watching, they were buried side by side, as if that could make the centuries of silence finally rest. It did not begin that way. Mary Stuart was first buried not in glory, but in restraint. After the axe had fallen at Fotheringhay Castle, her body was not granted immediate dignity. There was no grand procession, no requiem mass sung beneath high arches, no cathedral filled with mourning nobility. Instead, her remains were kept in a lead coffin, watched by guards and officials who feared even her corpse might spark rebellion. It was months before they dared move her. When they did, they placed her in Peterborough Cathedral, buried her under Protestant rites, and made no room for the Latin prayers she had whispered in her final hours. She had died a Catholic, But she was buried as an enemy of the Church of England, stripped of the ritual that had once crowned her in France, and denied the spiritual farewell her followers begged for. And yet, even there, Mary did not fade. Her name lingered in Catholic households across England. Her image was hidden behind tapestries, her face pressed into rosaries, her martyrdom spoken of in whispers. Across the sea, she became legend. Her death was printed in pamphlets, painted in oils, etched into glass windows as if she were a saint. To those who hated Elizabeth, Mary was not just a queen. She was the proof that Elizabeth's crown had been bought with blood. Rome remembered. Spain remembered. And so did her son, James, the boy who had been crowned King of Scots while his mother languished in exile, had never moved to save her while she lived. Raised in the Reformed religion, educated by Protestant lords, counseled by men who feared Mary's influence more than they loved her life, James had kept his distance. But blood has a way of calling through time, and when Elizabeth died in the year 1603, and the crown of England passed to James, uniting the thrones of two kingdoms under one head, the new king looked backward before he looked forward. One of his first royal acts was to have his mother's body exhumed from Peterborough and reinterred in Westminster Abbey, in a tomb worthy of a queen. It was an act of restoration, not just of dignity but of narrative. James built her a monument tall, regal, heavy with symbolism, white marble, cave effigy, Latin inscriptions that declared her titles with certainty. Queen of Scots, Queen of France, Queen Dowager, Widow, Martyr. No mention of execution. No mention of Elizabeth. Her hands were clasped in eternal prayer. Her face was composed. Her crown sat untouched. It was not the truth, but it was the truth he wanted to leave behind. And across from her, in the same abbey, lay Elizabeth. She too had been buried in a grand tomb. Her sarcophagus raised above her half-sister, Mary Tudor. The two daughters of Henry VIII entombed together beneath one sculpted likeness. Elizabeth's image was carved in stone serene, dignified, hands crossed, eyes closed, a round hair. The motto Semper Idem, always the same, curled in solemn Latin, though those who had known her in life might have said otherwise. She had changed. She had aged. She had lost friends, patience, beauty, and peace. But she had kept her crown, and now, in death, she kept her silence. The irony was almost unbearable. In life, Elizabeth had kept Mary locked behind walls. In death, Mary now rested within the same chapel, honored by the same abbey, watched by the same sunlight, filtering through ancient stained glass. Visitors would pass through Westminster's halls and see the names etched in gold and wonder how two women who had shared a hatred so profound could now share the air between tombs. But the abbey told no stories. The stones did not speak. They merely stood, as they always had. While history tried to make sense of what had never been fair, the kingdom did not speak of Mary after her reburial. Not loudly. Elizabeth was still beloved by many, still seen as the savior of Protestant England. The Virgin Queen, who had defied popes and kings and brought peace through strength. To admit regret, to question the execution, was to question the very legitimacy of Elizabeth's rule. So they chose silence. Silence in the churches, where Mary's name was never spoken from the pulpit. Silence in the courts, where her son ruled in her stead but never demanded justice for her death. Silence in the books of state, where the records recorded the date but not the weight of what had been done. It was easier that way. Easier to remember Mary as the Queen of Scots who had meddled, plotted, and fallen by her own hand. Easier to remember Elizabeth as the monarch who had no choice. But the people remembered differently. They told stories, in corners of old castles. The servants swore they had seen a woman in red walking the halls at night. Her face veiled, her steps silent. In small villages, mothers named daughters Mary with a kind of reverence. In secret masses, her death was honored each year, not as a crime, but as a holy sacrifice. And in the great halls of Europe, her execution remained a wound that never quite closed. Elizabeth may have ruled, but Mary had bled. And blood, unspilled, leaves a stain, even time cannot erase. So now, if you walk through the abbey in silence, and you stand between their tombs, you may feel it, that tension still hanging in the space between stone and story. The queen who reigned for decades, and the queen who died on a scaffold, the woman who held the axe, and the woman who received it. There is no plaque to explain it, no monument to the silence that followed, but it is there. In the hush of the tourists, in the flicker of candlelight, in the way even the air seems to know it is sacred ground. They buried them near each other, but not together. Not truly, for how could they ever rest beside one another, when one had written the warrant, and the other had bled for it? The silence of history is rarely absolute. Even when kings are buried and queens forgotten, something always lingers beneath floorboards, behind curtains, in the footnotes of forgotten letters, or the softest phrases in old prayers. And sometimes, it lingers in something as small and soft as a dog hidden beneath a gown. No one knew he was there, not the executioner, not the guards, not the scribes who recorded every cry and every drop of blood. But in those final moments, as the axe rose and fell and rose again, there was something alive beneath the silk and velvet. A small Skye terrier, curled at Mary's feet, refusing to leave his mistress, even when the last breath had fled her lips, when the blood had sprayed and the severed head had rolled. He was still there, trembling beneath the fabric, licking her feet, crying a sound no historian would write down, but which every witness remembered with shame. They tried to pull him away. His fur was soaked in her blood. He snapped at the hands that touched her. He whined so loudly that even the hardened soldiers looked down in guilt. He had not been trained in duty or betrayal. He had not read laws or whispered secrets into ciphered ink. He had only loved. And when they finally tore him from her, he cried for days, refusing food, refusing touch, curling in corners as if trying to disappear into memory itself. They said he died of grief, not long after Enchrumain, though no one marked his grave or carved his name into the walls of Fotheringhay. But in that small creature, loyal beyond all measure, something essential had been preserved, something history could never redact or polish. The rawness of it, the intimacy of a death watched not by power, but by devotion. The memory of Mary Stuart's death did not disappear with the cleaning of the hall or the turning of the page. It clung to England like morning mist that refused to lift. Elizabeth never mentioned the dog, never spoke of the final moments. But others did, the executioners, who drank heavily in the weeks that followed, the guards, who left Fotheringhay and never wished to return, the ladies, who went into mourning even when the court forbade it. It was not just a death, it was a scar. And as the years passed, that scar changed shape. In Protestant England, Mary became a cautionary tale, a symbol of the danger of Catholic plots and royal entitlement. In Catholic Europe, she became a saint. Her execution, a holy sacrifice. Her name spoken with reverence beside those of martyrs burned or broken for the same faith. Her image was printed in secret, passed from hand to hand. Her final words were carved into walls in candlelit churches. In manus tuas, Domine, commando spiritum meum, into thy hands. O Lord, I commend my spirit. She had died like a queen, and like a martyr, and like a woman utterly alone. But the memory would not die, not even when Elizabeth passed from this world, aged and childless. Her face no longer framed by golden hair, but by shadows and regret. In her final days, she refused to rest, pacing her rooms in silence, unable to lie down, as if something unseen waited just behind her shoulder. Her counselors begged her to sleep. She refused. They brought her books. She turned away. They lit candles. She asked for darkness. Some say she spoke to shadows in the corners. Others say she murmured only one name, over and over, but never aloud. And when the final moment came, and England's Virgin Queen passed into legend, the silence that followed felt less like closure and more like surrender. Mary had been dead 16 years by then, but her presence never truly faded. James, her son, ruled, now. Both thrones joined under his name. His mother's face etched into his memory, but rarely his speeches. He did not speak of her death often. But when he did, it was with cool precision, not anger, not sorrow, but the kind of deep discomfort that comes from knowing the mother you never saved still shaped the man you had become. He had moved her bones to Westminster Abbey. Yes, he had ordered the tomb, but he never sought vengeance, never condemned Elizabeth, never named the act for what it was, perhaps because he understood, better than anyone, that to inherit a kingdom was to inherit its crimes. Still, the people remembered. In corners of the realm where Catholic families still prayed in secret, her name was whispered with incense and sorrow. In Spain, her execution was displayed in tapestries and painted on tiles. In Rome, she was invoked as an icon of the suffering church. And in Scotland, among the hills, she had once ridden across as a girl queen laughing in the rain. There were old women who said her ghost still wandered the heather. Red velvet hem brushing the grass. Eyes forever searching for the sun who had not come. The world moved on, as it always does. Wars came and went. Kings were crowned and killed. The abbey filled with more tombs. But even century later, visitors paused longer at Mary's, not because it was more ornate, not because it was more beautiful, but because there was something beneath the stone, something unresolved, something quiet and terrible and true. And always, when they turned to leave, they looked across to where Elizabeth lay, and they wondered if two women who had never spoken face to face in life might now lie in endless conversation, their bones dreaming of different endings. History, of course, never changes, but memory does, and memory, like the small dog hidden beneath the gown, refuses to go quietly. It waits, it watches, it remembers. There are stories that England tells itself at dusk, whispers beneath the weight of its cathedrals, murmurs curled inside the shadows of stone abbeys and castle ruins, where voices once rang like bells but now lie buried under moss and dust. They are not written in law books or taught in schools, but they linger all the same, and among them, softest and sharpest, is the story of two queens who never met across a table. never stood in the same hall, and yet whose lives became so knotted together that even centuries later, the air between their tombs still hums with what might have been. One queen wore the crown until the end. The other died reaching for it. And between them lay a sentence that could never be unsaid. Mary Stuart died on a winter morning with Latin on her lips, velvet on her shoulders, and a dog hidden in the folds of her gown. Elizabeth Tudor died on a spring day, alone in a darkened chamber, her crown heavy on a table nearby, her hands empty of heirs and too full of ghosts. And between those deaths stretched a country that had grown used to silence, to swallowing what it could not forgive, to polishing its thrones while burying its sorrow. England did not want to remember what it had done. And yet England remembered anyway. Because memory is not a choice. Not really. You can lock it away in archives. Write over it with victories and marriages and treaties. But it finds its way back. In paintings, in ballads, in the creak of old oak steps, in the hush that falls when a tourist steps into Westminster Abbey and sees two queens facing each other across eternity, neither smiling, and no plaque explains the silence. They were cousins. Yes, but more than that, they were mirrors. One ruled with control, the other with passion. One chose strategy over intimacy. The other let love unravel her. One kept her head and her throne. The other lost both. And yet, when you strip away the politics, the plots, the religion, and the spies, what remains is this: two women, born with crowns already hovering over them, forced to live inside cages shaped like kingdoms, neither truly free, neither truly safe, and neither truly prepared for how much the world could take from them in the name of duty. Elizabeth had always known what the crown demanded. Her father's wives had taught her that. Her mother's death had written it into her bones. Love was dangerous. Trust was costly. Tears were private. And so she became the monarch. The world needed her to be clever, commanding, intouchable. But in doing so, she buried pieces of herself so deep that not even she could name them anymore. And when she signed Mary's death warrant, what she gave away was not just her cousin's life. It was something quieter, heavier, a part of her own soul. She regretted it. Not for politics. She remained queen, remained undefeated, held England together until her final breath, but for something older and more human. Regret that she had allowed fear to win. Regret that she had given in to the voices that told her there was no other way. Regret that, in the end, she had become the thing she had fought so long not to be. A woman remembered not just for what she built, but for what she destroyed. And Mary, who had never stopped calling herself a queen, even when no one else did, left behind something greater than a claim to the English throne. She left behind the image of a woman who knelt at the end of a long, brutal road and chose dignity. She had made mistakes, many, catastrophic ones. She had married badly, trusted poorly, schemed desperately, but she had never stopped believing in the divine right of her crown, and in the God who watched above it. She had walked to the scaffold as if it were a coronation, her hands unshaking, her lips steady, and the world saw it, and the world remembered. There were no last words between them, no reconciliation, no letters exchanged in those final days, just silence. But in that silence, something settled, something England still carries, a kind of grief without language, a kind of lesson too fragile for sermons, that power costs, that crowns cut, that even queens bleed. Now, centuries later, their tombs remain, unmoving in their majesty. Tourists pass them by. Cameras flash. Guide recite date. But sometimes, late in the day, when the sunlight slips low through the stained glass and the air grows cool, you can almost imagine them there, not in stone, but in memory. Two women standing in the great vaulted space between judgment and understanding. Elizabeth, robes stiff with age, eyes sharp, mouth firm. Mary, red velvet sweeping the floor, her hands folded in prayer, her face calm, not with defeat, but with something like peace. They say history is written by the victors, but memory belongs to the dreamers. And the dreamers remember them both, not as rulers, not as rivals, but as women, women who bore more than any should have, who were asked to choose between safety and truth, between love and survival, between silence and justice. And in the end, both paid the price. So tonight, if you find yourself beneath warm blankets, your eyes heavy, your thoughts drifting like ships through fog, I think of them not as queens on coins or portraits in oil, but as women who tried to shape a world that would not bend, one with ink, the other with blood, one with silence, the other with song. And if you feel a chill, it is only the past reaching gently for your hand, asking you to remember that behind every crown, there is always a cost. Sleep now. England. The story has been told. The axe has been lowered. The tombs remain. But the silence is ours to break.